highlands of northern Ethiopia, there are churches carved straight down into living rock, not built on the surface and decorated later. Carved, from the top down. Workers began at ground level and cut downward, chiseling out corridors and chambers and pillars from a single mass of volcanic stone. The roofs sit level with the earth, so that from above you might walk across a grassy plateau and nearly miss the fact that beneath your feet an entire cathedral descends into the ground. The most famous of these are at Lalibela, a cluster of 11 rock-hewn churches dating to the 12th and 13th centuries, each one a monolith, each one still in active use. You descend through narrow passages. You step into chambers that hold the coolness of night even at midday. The walls carry the residue of centuries of incense, wood smoke, and beeswax. And the air feels older, not because of superstition, but because stone holds time differently than wood or plaster. Sound behaves differently, light falls differently. Your footsteps echo against surfaces that were shaped by hands 800 years ago and have not been altered since. And inside those chambers, behind curtains that only ordained priests may draw aside, there are manuscripts, written in a language called Ge'ez, ancient, Semitic, distantly related to Hebrew and Aramaic. Ge'ez has not been spoken in daily conversation for centuries, but it remains the liturgical language of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, the way Latin once functioned in the Catholic Mass. The manuscripts are copied on vellum, animal skin stretched thin enough to hold ink, but thick enough to survive 1,000 years of mountain air. The ink is made from lampblack and gum Arabic. The script is angular and precise, each character drawn with a reed pen sharpened to a chisel point. These manuscripts contain a Bible, but not the Bible you know. Tonight we follow that library, not the modern printed idea of one Bible, one cover, one table of contents. The older reality, a collection of books that grew, shifted, and settled differently depending on where it lived. We will begin with something simple and surprisingly powerful, how a book becomes standard and how another book becomes rare. Then we will step into two of the most famous missing texts, the Book of Enoch, with its watchers and its strange moral universe, and the Book of Jubilees, with its obsession with sacred time and cosmic order. We will follow the manuscripts through Alexandria, through the Dead Sea caves, through the Ethiopian highlands, and by the end, you will understand how some books do not vanish in a single dramatic moment. More often, they fade quietly, because fewer hands keep copying them. Everywhere, except the places that never let them go. Get comfortable. We will take it slowly. The Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church has 81 books in its Bible, 46 in the Old Testament, 35 in the New. The Protestant Bible, the one most English speakers would recognize from a bookshop shelf, has 66. The Catholic Bible has 73. The Eastern Orthodox canons vary, but most land somewhere near 76 or 78. The Ethiopian Bible has 81. That is not a small difference. That is 15 additional books beyond what most Protestant readers have ever encountered. Entire texts, with their own theologies, their own histories, their own visions of what God intended when He spoke to humanity. Among those additional books are texts that have fascinated scholars and historians for centuries. The Book of Enoch, 108 chapters describing the fall of angels, the origins of evil, and visions of the end of days. The Book of Jubilees, sometimes called Little Genesis, which retells the stories of creation and the patriarchs inside a precise mathematical framework of sacred time. The 3 books of Maccabean, entirely unique to the Ethiopian tradition, unrelated to the Maccabees despite sharing a similar name in some translations. And the Kebra Nagast, the Glory of Kings, which tells a story connecting Ethiopia directly to Solomon, the Queen of Sheba, and the Ark of the Covenant. These are not footnotes. The letter of Jude, in the New Testament that every Christian tradition accepts, directly quotes the Book of Enoch, quotes it by name, as though the audience would recognize the reference immediately. And yet, in most of the world's Bibles, the Book of Enoch is absent. So the question is not, why does Ethiopia have extra books? The question is, why did everyone else lose them? Now, imagine the moment a manuscript is actually open. Not a dramatic unveiling, a careful routine. A wooden chest is set down on a stone ledge, and the lid lifts with a soft, dry sound. Cloth is unfolded, layer after layer, because dust and sunlight are enemies of ink. The manuscript is heavy for its size, not because it is thick like a modern textbook, but because vellum has the weight of the animal it came from, because hand-stitched binding carries the tension of thread pulled tight, because time adds density to anything that survives long enough to hold. When the pages move, they do not flutter the way paper does. They turn slowly, almost reluctantly, as if the book remembers the life it was made from. The surface is smooth in places and rough in others, with the faint grain of skin still visible where the scribe's blade did not fully thin the hide. And there is a smell, not the bright chemical smell of new paper, a warmer smell. Beeswax from the candles that have surrounded these pages for centuries, smoke from incense that has settled into the fibers, oil from hands that have touched the margins, a faint tang of iron from the ink itself, and a trace of leather from the binding. The lines are ruled with intention. You can sometimes see the pressure of the ruling tool in the page, a groove that catches the light at certain angles. Some pages are smoother than others. On a quiet day, you can see where a scribe's hand rested again and again over the years, darkening the edge of the parchment with the oils of his skin. This is what it means to preserve a library before the invention of the printing press. It is physical craft. The book is a thing you carry in your arms, a thing you protect from rain and insects and the slow decay of humidity, a thing you place high on a shelf, not out of secrecy but out of care. In the Ethiopian highlands, altitude helps, dry mountain air helps, stone buildings that hold a steady temperature help, but habit helps most. A scribe does not copy a text once and set it aside. He copies it in a culture where copying is normal, where the act of reproduction is woven into the rhythms of monastic life. In some monasteries, copying is paired with illumination. Pigments are ground from minerals and mixed with binders. Plant dyes are prepared in small batches. Gold leaf is applied where a page needs to shine even in dim lamplight. Then the book is stitched. Pages are folded into quires. Quires are sewn together with heavy thread. Wooden boards are attached to the spine, and a leather cover is wrapped around the whole assembly. When the book is finished, it becomes part of a chest, part of a rhythm, taken out for reading, returned to darkness, taken out again when the liturgy requires it. This is why Ethiopia's shelf stayed large, because the shelf was not a shelf. It was a set of habits that kept producing books. To understand why certain books survived in Ethiopia and nowhere else, you follow the path of the faith itself, and that path begins earlier than most people expect. According to the tradition of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, Christianity reached the region in the 1st century, carried by the Ethiopian eunuch, described in the 8th chapter of the Book of Acts. This is the court official of Queen Candace, who was reading from the scroll of Isaiah in his chariot on the road from Jerusalem to Gaza. Philip the evangelist approached him, explained the passage, and the eunuch was baptized in water by the roadside. According to Ethiopian tradition, he returned to the kingdom of Aksum and planted the seeds of a church that would grow for 2,000 years without interruption. In Ethiopian memory, the eunuch's return is the beginning of a long continuity. Christianity in Ethiopia is ancient, not a branch grafted onto a European trunk, an independent root, drawing from the same soil but growing in its own direction. By the 4th century, the kingdom of Aksum was one of the great civilizations of the ancient world. It controlled trade routes linking the Roman Mediterranean to the Indian Ocean. Its merchants dealt in ivory, gold, spices, and incense. Its coins, minted with Greek inscriptions, have been found as far away as India and Sri Lanka. Aksum was not isolated. It was cosmopolitan, multilingual, and powerful. Around the year 330, King Ezana adopted Christianity as the official religion of Aksum. To put that in perspective, that is roughly the same moment the Roman Emperor Constantine was consolidating Christianity's position in the Roman world. Ethiopia did not receive the faith late. It received it early, and it received it through different channels. The man credited with formally establishing the Ethiopian church is a figure named Frumentius. He was a young man from Tyre, in modern-day Lebanon, who was shipwrecked on the Red Sea coast while traveling with his uncle. The uncle was killed. Frumentius and his companion, a boy named Idesius, were brought to the Aksumite court, where they gradually rose to positions of trust and influence. Frumentius became tutor to the young prince, and eventually the de facto administrator of the kingdom during the prince's minority. When the prince came of age, Frumentius traveled to Alexandria in Egypt to request that the patriarch send a bishop to oversee the growing Christian community in Aksum. The patriarch at the time was Athanasius, one of the most important theologians in the history of the church, a man who had battled the Arian heresy across multiple exiles and whose influence shaped the Nicene Creed. Athanasius looked at Frumentius and said, effectively, "Who better to be bishop than you?" He consecrated Frumentius on the spot and sent him back to Ethiopia. And this is the critical detail that shapes everything that follows. The Ethiopian church was connected to Alexandria, not to Rome, not to Constantinople, not to Antioch, to Alexandria. Why does this matter so much? Because Alexandria was the intellectual capital of the ancient Mediterranean. It was a city built around libraries and arguments, around texts and the copying of texts. Even the idea of official doctrine there was linked to manuscripts, to scribal production, to argument by quotation. Alexandria had its own collection of sacred texts, its own theological emphases, its own scribal traditions. And the books that traveled to Ethiopia through Alexandrian networks were not identical to the books that traveled through Latin-speaking Rome. The Alexandrian church preserved a wider range of Jewish and early Christian literature, including texts that the Latin West would eventually stop copying. When Athanasius sent Frumentius back to Ethiopia, he was not just sending a bishop, he was exporting a manuscript culture. The scriptures were translated into Ge'ez, the literary language of the Aksumite kingdom. And once a text was translated into Ge'ez and established in Ethiopian liturgy, it was protected by the most powerful preservation system available in the ancient world: regular use. A book that is read in worship does not fade. It is copied again and again because the community needs it for the service next Sunday, and the one after that, and the one 100 years from now. The monasteries maintained it. The scribal schools reproduced it. The deacons who trained for ordination learned to read it. The faithful who attended services heard it spoken aloud, week after week, year after year, century after century. The Ethiopian church developed a monastic tradition of extraordinary depth and continuity. Monasteries like Debre Damo, perched on a flat-topped mountain, accessible only by climbing a rope up a sheer cliff face, functioned as living archives for centuries. Monks who entered these communities often remained for life, and part of their daily work was the reproduction of manuscripts, not as a scholarly exercise, as a devotional act. The copying of scripture was itself a form of prayer, and so texts that faded elsewhere survived in the Ethiopian highlands, not because Ethiopia was hiding them, not because someone smuggled them out of a burning library, because Ethiopia was using them, continuously, in worship, in education, in the daily rhythm of a church that has been operating without interruption for 1700 years. The books survived because Ethiopian Christians never stopped reading them. To feel how early Ethiopian Christianity becomes a textual tradition, imagine the roots again. The port of Adulis on the Red Sea coast, ropes damp with salt, hulls swollen from the water, cargo stacked on the docks, incense resin in sacks, ivory tusks, spices, woven cloth. A merchant world is always a language world, and Adulis was where languages crossed paths. Axumite coins carried Greek inscriptions. Traders spoke Arabic and local tongues. Court officials moved between languages the way modern diplomats move between meetings. And scribes carried the skill that mattered most, the ability to fix words in place. When Frumentius traveled to Alexandria, he stepped into a city where words were currency. Alexandria was not only a cathedral city, it was a library city. The culture of scholarship there ran so deep that even theological disputes were fought with manuscripts and quotations. So when Athanasius consecrated Frumentius, he was also sending a man trained to value books, trained to see the written word as the container of faith itself. From that point onward, Ethiopian Christianity grew with two lungs working together, ritual and writing. A liturgy that held memory in song and gesture, and a scribal practice that held it in ink on skin. The translation into Ge'ez was decisive because it created a fixed container for the scriptures. Even as spoken languages shifted over the centuries, Ge'ez remained stable, a literary anchor that kept the texts in their original translated form. A person could walk into a church 1,000 years after Frumentius and hear the same language read aloud. That continuity is what made preservation not only possible, but inevitable. And it is what turned extra books into normal books. Of all the texts preserved in the Ethiopian canon, the one that draws the most attention from the outside world is the Book of Enoch. Its full title in scholarly circles is First Enoch, to distinguish it from two later texts also attributed to the patriarch. It is a long and complex work, likely composed by multiple authors across several centuries, with the earliest portions dating to perhaps the 3rd century before Christ. It runs to 108 chapters, divided by modern scholars into 5 major sections: the Book of the Watchers, the Book of Parables, the Astronomical Book, the Book of Dream Visions, and the Epistle of Enoch. Each section has its own character, its own imagery, its own concerns. For most of recorded history, the only complete version of this text known to exist anywhere on Earth was the Ethiopian Ge'ez translation. Fragments existed in Greek. References appeared in early Jewish and Christian writings. Scholars knew the book had once been influential, but the full text survived only in the Ethiopian highlands, maintained by a church that considered it canonical and never stopped including it in its Bible. In 1773, a Scottish explorer named James Bruce travelled to Ethiopia. Bruce was a remarkable figure, over 6 feet tall, red-haired, fluent in multiple languages, and possessed of the kind of relentless curiosity that drove 18th century adventurers to cross continents on horseback. He was searching for the source of the Nile, and along the way, he encountered the Ethiopian church and its manuscripts. Bruce brought back 3 copies of the Ge'ez Book of Enoch. When the text was eventually translated into English in the early 19th century by Richard Lawrence, the Archbishop of Cashel, it caused a quiet earthquake in biblical scholarship. Because Enoch told a story that most Western Christians had never encountered in full. A story about the boundary between heaven and earth, about knowledge that was never meant to be given, and about the consequences of crossing lines that the cosmos itself had drawn. The central narrative of the Book of the Watchers begins with 200 heavenly beings called the Watchers. In the original Aramaic, the word is irin, which means the awake ones, or those who watch. They are heavenly figures, dispatched to earth to observe humanity from a distance. Their assigned role is surveillance. They are meant to witness, not to act. But the Watchers act. Under the leadership of a figure called Semjaza, whose name means, "My name has seen," the 200 descend to Mount Hermon and swear an oath together. They know what they are about to do is a transgression. They bind themselves to the act collectively, so that no single watcher can back out and leave the others to face the consequences alone. It is a conspiracy, deliberate and premeditated. They will cross the boundary between the divine realm and the human one. They will take human wives, they will have children, and they will teach humanity secrets that were never meant to be revealed. And here is where the story becomes vivid in a way that has haunted readers for over 2,000 years. The Watcher called Azazel taught men to forge swords and knives and shields and breastplates. He revealed to them the metals of the earth and the art of working them. He taught women to use antimony for the eyes, to beautify their eyelids, to adorn themselves with precious stones and coloring tinctures. In a single passage, the text attributes to a fallen angel the origins of warfare and vanity in the same breath. The instruments of killing and the instruments of seduction delivered together by the same hand. Semjaza taught enchantments and the cutting of roots, the ancient world's way of describing both herbal medicine and sorcery. Barakijal taught astrology. Kokabeel taught the constellations. Ezekiel taught knowledge of the clouds. Arakiel taught the signs of the earth. Shamsiel taught the signs of the sun. Sariel taught the course of the moon. Read that list slowly and you realize what it represents. Metallurgy, pharmacology, astronomy, cosmetics, divination, agriculture, weather prediction, navigation by stars. The entire toolkit of early civilization delivered not through generations of slow human discovery, each lesson built on the one before it, each failure teaching caution, but all at once dumped into the hands of a species that had not earned the judgment to wield it. The Book of Enoch is not saying that knowledge is evil. It is saying something more subtle and more disturbing, that the wrong knowledge, given at the wrong time, to a species not ready to carry it, will destroy them. The Watchers did not merely break a rule, they broke the pace of creation itself. They gave humanity the instruments of war before humanity had developed the capacity for restraint. They gave humanity the tools of deception before humanity had developed the habit of truth, and the result, according to Enoch, was catastrophe. The children of the Watchers and human women were the Nephilim, beings of enormous size and appetite who consumed everything the earth produced, who drank blood, who turned on one another in savage violence. The earth itself cried out under the weight of what had been unleashed. God responded. He sent the archangel Raphael to bind Azazel in chains and cast him into a pit of jagged rocks in the desert, a place called Dudael, his face covered so that he could see no light, where he would remain in darkness until the day of judgment, when he would be cast into fire. He sent Michael to bind Semjaza and the other Watchers in pits beneath the earth for 70 generations, and he sent the flood to cleanse what had been corrupted, warning Noah through the archangel Uriel so that the human race would not be entirely destroyed. But even after the flood, the damage was not fully undone. According to Enoch, when the Nephilim died, their spirits did not disappear. Because they were born of both heaven and earth, their disembodied spirits remained on the earth as evil spirits, afflicting humanity from that day forward. The corruption was embedded. The knowledge could not be unlearned. The weapons could not be unmade. You do not need to treat any of this as literal history to understand why the Book of Enoch mattered to the communities that preserved it and why it resonates now. It answers a question that haunts every civilization. Why does the world feel broken? Not because humans are weak, but because knowledge arrived faster than wisdom, because the tools outpaced the hands that held them, because what was meant to unfold slowly was forced open all at once. You can hear echoes of that idea every time someone asks whether a new technology has arrived before we are ready for it, whether the power we have built exceeds the judgment we possess, whether the speed of discovery has outrun the speed of ethics. The Watchers are not only characters in an ancient text, they are a pattern, and the pattern repeats. That is why Ethiopian scribes kept copying this book for 17 centuries. It was not a curiosity, it was a mirror. Now return to the Watchers, but stay inside the scene a little longer. Imagine the moment after the oath on Mount Hermon. The air is thin at that altitude, cold enough to sting the lungs. The ground is hard and dry. The sound of wind over rock is constant, steady as breath. The watchers move as a group, not running, not rushing, descending like a decision becoming real, like a thought passing the point where it can still be taken back. And as they move into the human world, the story shifts from the cosmic to the intimate. A lesson is given in a quiet clearing. A hand is shown how to grip a tool for the first time. A substance is placed in a fire, and something remarkable happens. Metal softens, becomes liquid, then hardens into a new shape. A blade is lifted, and for the first time, a human holds an object designed to cut through flesh. Not just a weapon, a new relationship between human will and the human body. Then another lesson. A pigment is ground from a mineral and mixed with oil. A line is drawn along the eyelid. The face changes. Beauty becomes something that can be designed, applied, wielded. And with that comes leverage. Because the ability to alter how you appear is the ability to alter how others respond to you. Then another lesson still. Words are spoken with precision over a bundle of roots. Signals are read in the movement of clouds, in the position of stars, in the patterns of birds in flight. The knowledge accumulates faster than the species can absorb it. The myth makes its point without ever stating it as a thesis. Power arrives in many forms. It arrives as technology. It arrives as persuasion. It arrives as the ability to read time and weather and the fears of other people. And when all of these arrive at once, the world buckles. So when the archangels appear, Michael, Gabriel, Raphael, Uriel, it feels like a courtroom finally opening its doors after a long silence. The case is heard. The verdict moves like law. Azazel is bound. Semjaza is sealed in darkness. The flood is sen. In Enoch, restoration is not chaotic. It is procedural. The universe notices what has gone wrong and responds with structure. That is part of why the story can feel calming even when it describes catastrophe. It insists that disorder is observed. It insists that the cosmos is not asleep. There is a section of Enoch that rarely gets discussed in popular accounts, but it is one of the most hypnotic passages in all of ancient literature. The astronomical book describes the movement of the sun through a series of gates in the sky. Not one gate, a system. The sun rises through a different gate depending on the season, shifting slightly north or south as the year turns. Each gate is numbered. Each transition is measured. The year is divided into a 364-day cycle, clean and divisible by 7, so that every week lands in its proper place without drift. Seasons become rooms in a cosmic building. Spring enters through one door, summer through another. The light increases by measured amounts, then decreases by the same amounts on the other side of the year. You can treat this as early astronomy or as symbolic architecture, but either way it produces a feeling. The feeling that the sky is ordered, that the world above the clouds operates on a schedule that was set at the beginning of time and has not changed since. And if the world above is structured, then perhaps the world below can be structured too. Perhaps the chaos of human life is not the final word. Perhaps there is a framework holding everything in place, even when it feels like nothing is held at all. This is why texts like Enoch and Jubilees cling to calendars and cycles. A calendar is not just a way of counting days. A calendar is belonging. It tells a community when to gather, when to fast, when to sing, when to rest. And when a community shares a calendar, it shares a heartbeat. The astronomical book works beautifully as sleep content because it does exactly what the mind needs before it lets go. It offers repeating patterns, gates and cycles and measured turns, a cosmos that feels like a quiet machine, running without human effort, holding its shape while you drift away. If the Book of Enoch is about cosmic rebellion, the Book of Jubilees is about cosmic order. It is sometimes called Little Genesis because it retells the stories of Genesis and the early chapters of Exodus. But calling it a retelling undersells what it actually does. Jubilees doesn't only repeat the old stories, it organizes them, it frames them, it assigns them coordinates in time, and it does this with a single, stubborn belief. Time is not neutral. Time is architecture. Jubilees presents itself as revelation given to Moses on Mount Sinai. Not only law, not only commandments, but an ordered account of the past, delivered through an angel. That framing matters. Why claim an angel is dictating history? Because it makes the past feel recorded, not guessed, not improvised, recorded. The book wants you to feel that the story of the world exists in a ledger, a set of heavenly tablets, a schedule kept beyond human error. Jubilees organizes sacred history into cycles of 49 years, each one called a jubilee, 7 weeks of years, 7 times 7. It is a calendar turned into a philosophy. Events are placed inside this grid like stones set into a wall. A birth happens in a year. A covenant happens in a year. A journey happens in a year. The past becomes measurable, and beneath all of it is the central obsession, a calendar that does not drift. A drifting calendar is not only an inconvenience, it is a slow disagreement. It forces someone to decide when the month begins. It forces someone to declare when the feast will happen. And once the decision is public, it divides the people who accept it from the people who do not. So a fixed calendar becomes more than astronomy. It becomes authority. It says, we do not improvise sacred time. We receive it. That is why Jubilees is strict about the year, not because it hates the moon, because it fears what arguments do to a community. When time is disputed, everything becomes disputed. Jubilees uses a solar year of exactly 364 days, a year that divides evenly by 7, 52 weeks, no remainder. That means holy days always land where they belong. Festivals fall on the same day of the week every year. There is no constant adjustment, no debate, no sliding. Why would a community care enough about a calendar to build an entire sacred book around it? Because in the ancient world, a calendar was identity. Your calendar determined when you fasted, when you feasted, when you gathered, when you rested. It synchronized your community. It drew lines between those who shared your rhythm and those who did not. So when Jubilees rejects lunar scheduling, it is not making a minor technical point. It is defending a boundary. If festival days drift, what happens to unity? When one village keeps Passover while another village waits, trust becomes strain, rhythm becomes argument. Jubilees treats the lunar calendar as deviation, a corruption, a quiet betrayal of the cosmos. You can hear the deeper anxiety behind that insistence, not fear of the moon, fear of fragmentation, fear of becoming multiple communities without realizing it. The book does more than argue about days. It reshapes familiar patriarchal stories with added emphasis. It reinforces separation, purity, covenant boundaries. It adds details about marriages, kinship, inheritance, the timing of births, the timing of oaths. It insists on lines that must not be crossed. And it does this the way a builder reinforces a structure before a storm. The effect is not merely legal, it is emotional. The book tries to make belonging feel solid. It also does something subtle. It takes the ordinary uncertainties of life and pushes them into the background. In Genesis, a story can feel like a river. It moves, it turns, it surprises. In Jubilees, the river is channeled. It runs between banks. The patriarchs become figures inside a measured world. Each season has a moral shape. Each boundary is reinforced. Even sin becomes something that can be located. A day, a decision, a consequence. If you are the kind of mind that fears chaos, this is soothing. If you are the kind of mind that fears control, it is unsettling. But either way, it is coherent. And coherence is a kind of preservation. A text that teaches you to count time becomes memorable. A text that aligns worship with a schedule becomes usable. A usable text stays on the desk. A text that stays on the desk gets copied. Jubilees is also full of the kind of secondary detail that makes a tradition feel lived in. It adds names where older narratives are silent. It tightens genealogies. It explains why certain customs exist. It places familiar episodes into a wider pattern, like a quilt stitched into place. The point is not trivia. The point is texture. A community hears these details and feels that the story has edges you can hold. Notice how this connects to the larger theme of tonight. The Watcher's story warned about knowledge arriving too early. Jubilees is what you write when you want the opposite. You want time to behave. You want seasons to arrive on schedule. You want worship to land on the correct day with no argument. You want heaven and earth to match. There is also a sensory layer to this book that often gets missed. Imagine scribes who count, not only words, weeks. Imagine a teacher who explains a festival not as around spring, but as on the 4th day of the week, on this fixed date. A child learns the pattern early. The pattern becomes comfort. The year becomes a circle that never wobbles. For a community living under pressure, that steadiness is a kind of shelter. Now here is the proof that Jubilees was not fringe. At Qumran, among the Dead Sea Scrolls, fragments of Jubilees appear again and again. 15 manuscripts. 15. That number is a vote cast in vellum and ink. A community does not copy a text 15 times if it is irrelevant. So Jubilees was central to at least one devout Jewish community near the time of Jesus. It sat on shelves alongside books every modern tradition calls scripture. It was treated as authoritative enough to preserve, enough to study, enough to copy repeatedly. If a book could be that important then, how did it become unfamiliar later? The answer is the same quiet arithmetic we keep returning to. Copying slows. Translation corridors narrow. Lectionaries settle. Institutions standardize. A text can fade without a single ban being announced. And yet, in Ethiopia, Jubilees does not become a whisper. It stays living. It stays copyable. It stays on the shelf. Because the shelf is protected by use. In that context, a calendar is not only theory, it is practiced. Fast days come, feast days come, processions return like seasons. The same passages are read, the same rhythms are repeated. And repetition is a kind of glue. It holds texts in place. Now imagine the scribe again. A monastery in the highlands, a table, a lamp, a ruled page. Before the ink touches parchment, the page is prepared. Lines are ruled, margins are set. A rhythm is laid down in graphite or in the faint scratch of a stylus. Even the page becomes a calendar. Then comes the work. The scribe copies. He pauses. He checks. He counts. He listens to the monastery around him. A footstep in the corridor. A cough. The low murmur of prayer. Outside, weather shifts over mountains. Inside, the page stays still. He counts not to rush, but to stay accurate, because accuracy, in this tradition, is devotion. A day, a week, a jubilee. The book's obsession becomes the scribe's habit, and in the act of copying, he is doing what the book itself demands. He is aligning. He is saying, the rhythm has not been lost. So if Enoch gives you a myth about knowledge arriving too early, Jubilees gives you the opposite. A myth about order arriving first. A belief that the universe has a schedule, and that sacred life should fit inside it. Now we step back again and watch what happens when shelves narrow elsewhere. Not with drama, with silence, with fewer hands writing by lamplight. Here is the part of the story that most people get wrong. When someone says the Book of Enoch was removed from the Bible, they are imagining a single moment. A council of men in ceremonial robes, sitting around a table, voting on which books stay and which books go. A hand reaching up to a shelf and pulling down a scroll. A door closing with a heavy lock. A decree sent to every church in the world. This book is out. That is not how it happened. The formation of the biblical canon was not an event. It was a process that unfolded across centuries, unevenly, inconsistently, and differently in every region that had a Christian community. In the 2nd and 3rd centuries after Christ, there was no single, universal list of agreed-upon scriptures. There was no central authority with the power to dictate what every church in every city should read. A church in Rome might possess texts that a church in Antioch had never seen. A church in Alexandria might treat a book as essential for worship that a church in Carthage considered merely edifying. Communities exchanged manuscripts when travelers or merchants carried them along trade routes, but distribution was slow, expensive, and never complete. What eventually emerged were patterns of agreement, not a single dramatic vote, a slow convergence driven by practical needs. Which books do we read in worship? Which books do we trust enough to copy at great expense and distribute to our neighbors? Which books have our teachers been quoting for as long as anyone can remember? Over time, these questions produced layers of consensus. There were texts that nearly everyone used, texts that formed the core of Christian scripture across almost every community. There were texts that most communities used, accepted as valuable, but not quite as universal. There were texts that some communities used, beloved in certain regions, but unknown in others. And there were texts that only a few communities used, maintained by one tradition, while the rest of the world moved on. The books that ended up in the Protestant canon were mostly from that first category. The texts that achieved near universal agreement across the ancient Mediterranean world. The books that ended up only in the Ethiopian canon were often from the 3rd or 4th, texts that certain communities valued deeply, but that never spread widely enough to achieve consensus. And here is where language becomes the invisible border that determines which books survive and which ones fade. The Bible traveled through many languages on its way to the modern world: Hebrew, Aramaic, Greek, Latin, Syriac, Coptic, Ge'ez. At each translation point, choices were made. Which texts are important enough to justify the enormous labor of translating them into a new language? Translation in the ancient world was not a casual project. It required years of skilled work, deep fluency in both the source and target languages, access to the original manuscripts, and a community willing to fund the effort. The Book of Enoch existed in Aramaic. It was translated into Greek. From Greek, it was translated into Ge'ez, but it was never widely translated into Latin, and Latin became the dominant language of Western Christianity. That single fact did more to erase the Book of Enoch from Western awareness than any council, any decree, any theological argument. When the Western Church settled on Jerome's Latin Vulgate as its standard Bible in the late 4th and early 5th centuries, any text that was not in the Vulgate was for practical purposes invisible to most Western Christians for the next 1,000 years. Jerome himself was aware of the Book of Enoch. He referenced it in his own writings. He knew it existed, but he did not include it in his translation. And once the Vulgate became the standard, the books outside it began to fade. Not banned, not condemned by name, simply not translated into the language that mattered most, and therefore not copied into Latin manuscripts, and therefore not read in Latin-speaking churches, and therefore not known to Latin-educated scholars, and therefore, over the course of several centuries, not known at all. Not known eventually became never existed. That is how powerful the absence of a translation can be. Meanwhile, in the Ethiopian highlands, a scribe was still copying, still turning animal skin into vellum, still mixing lampblack and gum Arabic into ink, still writing in Ge'ez, a language that had received its text through Alexandria, not through Rome, and that had no reason to adopt Rome's table of contents as its own. This is the mechanism by which books survive and books disappear. It is not dramatic. There is no villain. There is no conspiracy. There is only the slow, relentless arithmetic of attention. Which texts get copied and which ones do not. A book copied every generation becomes nearly indestructible. A book not copied for 3 generations becomes a whisper. A book not copied for 10 generations becomes silence. Ethiopia kept copying. The shelves stayed full. When the West becomes Latin, the shelf becomes Latin too. This is not an insult to the Latin tradition. It is a fact of transmission. Once a translation becomes dominant, it functions like a highway. Monasteries copy what travels on that highway. Teachers teach from it. Priests read from it every Sunday. Seminaries train their students in it. Over time, the highway begins to feel like the entire landscape, and the texts that did not make it onto the road become harder and harder to find. When printing arrives in the 15th century, it pours concrete on the highway. Printers select what is familiar and what will sell. Publishers standardize their tables of contents. Institutions adopt the printed editions for education and worship. A generation grows up inside one particular collection of books, then a second generation, then a third, and soon the shelf feels eternal, as though it has always been exactly this size and no other. But it has not always been this size. It is a snapshot of what survived best in one particular corridor of transmission. Ethiopia is a different corridor, different language, different route, different set of chests holding different manuscripts. So Ethiopia keeps books that become rare in the Latin mainstream, not because Ethiopia is adding foreign material to an established canon, because Ethiopia is continuing a tradition that was already in place before the Latin bottleneck narrowed the Western shelf. One of the quietest forces in any tradition is the lectionary, the schedule of what is read aloud in worship across the year. A book that remains in the lectionary remains alive. It is heard publicly, which means people know it, which means they ask for copies, which means scribes produce them. But if a text slips out of the reading cycle, it becomes private. And if it becomes private, fewer people know it. And if fewer people know it, fewer people request copies. And the shelf shrinks, even when nobody is angry, even when nobody has issued a ban. Ethiopia's strength is that many of its doors stayed in regular use. Many books kept being heard aloud in worship, and what is heard stays alive. In 1947, a Bedouin shepherd named Mohammed Ed-Dib was searching for a stray goat among limestone cliffs near the northwestern shore of the Dead Sea. The landscape there is pale and brittle, stone, dust, silence. He threw a stone into a cave, and instead of a dull thud, he heard pottery crack. That sound, sharp, hollow, became one of the most consequential sounds in modern biblical scholarship. Inside the cave were tall clay jars, sealed with lids. Inside the jars were scrolls wrapped in linen. They had been sitting in dry desert air for about 2,000 years, and at first, nobody knew what to do with them. The jars matter. Clay is porous, but lids can seal. Linen can cushion. Dry air can slow decay. A cave can become a vault. Rolled manuscripts rest like sleeping animals. The outer layers darken. The inner layers stay pale. And time passes without ceremony. The earliest stage of the Dead Sea Scroll story is not tidy scholarship. It is movement, hands, dealers, rumors, fragments changing owners. Some scrolls passed through the antiquities market before scholars could secure them. Some were handled by people who did not yet understand what they were holding. The region itself was unstable in the late 1940s. Borders were changing. Institutions were being formed. People were moving, and in that chaos, ancient manuscripts moved too. How many priceless discoveries begin not in a museum, but in a marketplace? Over the next 9 years, from 1947 to 1956, it wasn't just one cave. 11 caves near the ruins of an ancient settlement called Qumran yielded hundreds of manuscripts and tens of thousands of fragments. Not a single scroll. A library shattered into stone. Biblical texts, community rules, commentaries, hymns, calendars, apocalyptic visions. It was an ecosystem, and it showed scholars something they had suspected but could not prove. The ancient world was not standardized. In that ecosystem, the Bible was only one layer. There were rules for communal life, texts that read like constitutions, hymns for night prayer, commentaries that take a line from a prophet and apply it to the present, as if Scripture is speaking directly to the community's own crisis. There were visions of war, visions of angels, visions of an ordered cosmos. And there were practical documents too, lists, schedules, fragments of everyday administration. A library is never only one genre. It is a mind in many moods. Different versions, different emphases, different shelves. Some scrolls were dramatic because they were almost complete. A long scroll of Isaiah, for example, survived in near full form. The physical fact of that survival mattered. It meant scholars could compare a biblical book copied around the turn of the era with manuscripts copied more than 1,000 years later. And the differences were not catastrophic, but they were real. Spellings, word choices, occasional lines. The Bible was stable, but not frozen. Other caves were dramatic for the opposite reason, because they contained fragments, thousands of fragments. Cave 4, in particular, became a blizzard of broken text, pieces, scraps, edges, corners. A library turned into confetti. This is where the work became slow, because reconstruction is not romantic, it is patient. Some scrolls could not be opened without breaking. Scholars learned to soften layers with controlled humidity, to support brittle sheets with backing, to unroll a page a fraction at a time. A single tear could erase a line forever. So the work demanded a strange kind of courage, the courage to go slowly. A fragment the size of a fingernail can contain a single letter, but that letter has a shape, and the shape has a style, and the style belongs to a period and a region and a scribe. Scholars compared repeated phrases, aligned torn edges, matched the grain of parchment. Sometimes they held fragments under magnification and waited for patterns to reveal themselves. Rebuilding a library from crumbs becomes an art of patience. Fragments are compared, aligned, and tested until a page begins to reappear. The scrolls came on different materials. Some were on parchment, made from animal skin. Some were on papyrus, pressed from reeds. Ink sat differently on each surface. Fibers caught light differently. Aging changed textures, and the desert did what deserts do. It preserved. Among those preserved fragments were manuscripts of Enoch, not in Ge'ez, in Aramaic, the original language in which the earliest portions were composed. 11 fragmentary manuscripts of 1st Enoch were found at Qumran, written on leather and papyrus. They contain portions from 4 of the 5 major sections: the Book of the Watchers, the Astronomical Book, the Dream Visions, and the Epistle. The Book of Parables is the only major section not represented, which fits the scholarly suspicion that it was composed later. That detail is quietly important. It means the story we told earlier is not a medieval invention. It is not a late Ethiopian flourish. It is an ancient Jewish text, circulating in devout communities centuries before Christianity took its final shape. If Enoch was circulating that early, why did it vanish from so many later shelves? Then there is Jubilees. Fragments of Jubilees were found at Qumran too. Not 1, not 2, 15 manuscripts. 15. That makes Jubilees one of the most frequently copied texts in the entire collection. Think about that. An ancient community copied Jubilees more often than Ecclesiastes, more often than Esther, more often than Chronicles. It tells us that the categories modern readers treat as solid, canonical and non-canonical, were not solid in practice. They were gradients. A community kept what it used. A community copied what it loved. A community preserved what it considered necessary. And this is the key. The Dead Sea Scrolls did not hand the world a final list. What they did was simpler. They proved diversity. They proved that Scripture, in practice, existed as a wider field than later standardization suggests. And once you see that, Ethiopia makes immediate sense. Ethiopia didn't add Enoch and Jubilees to a settled canon. Ethiopia kept copying them from a world where wider shelves were normal. For modern readers, that is the shock. Not that ancient people were strange, but that ancient people were plural. They lived inside multiple textual streams at once. A prophet could be read in one version in one region and in another version somewhere else. A story could carry extra chapters without anyone feeling it was an attack. The boundaries were softer. Then, over centuries, boundaries hardened. Translation helps one stream more than another. Institutions choose what to read aloud. Schools teach what is easiest to acquire. And the shelves shrink without anyone making a speech about it. The Dead Sea Scrolls show you the moment before the narrowing becomes complete. They are a snapshot, a freeze frame. And that is why they matter to the Ethiopian story. Because they demonstrate that the Ethiopian shelf is not an invention. It is a survival. A living corridor that kept copying what the wider ancient world once held in common. Modern scholarship also learns something practical. If you want a text to survive, you can do one of two things. You can hide it, seal it in a jar, hope the climate is kind. Or you can use it, read it, copy it, make it part of the weekly rhythm. One method depends on luck, the other depends on discipline. The scrolls also teach a final lesson, one that ties directly to Ethiopia. There are two kinds of preservation. Accidental preservation, where dry air and sealed jars hold a text for centuries without human touch. And intentional preservation, where living communities keep copying so the chain never breaks. One kind can be miraculous. The other kind can be disciplined. And the question is simple. Which kind do you want your knowledge to depend on? Ethiopia represents the second kind. Habit, routine, hands. And because of that, the wider library survived in one place, even as it faded elsewhere. Think of the contrast. A cave in the desert, holding a library by accident. A monastery in the mountains, holding a library by intention. One is silence. The other is song. One is sealed. The other is copied. Both are forms of memory. But only one can last without luck. There is another text that sits near the heart of Ethiopian Christianity, not because it is quoted the way Genesis is quoted, not because it is treated as a universal Christian document, but because it is identity. It is called the Kebra Nagast, the glory of kings. The Kebra Nagast tells the story of the Queen of Sheba, known in Ethiopia as Makeda, and her journey to Jerusalem to meet King Solomon. The biblical account is brief: a visit, a test of wisdom, gifts exchanged, a return home. The Kebra Nagast takes that handful of verses and expands them into an epic. It fills the air around the scene. It turns a meeting into a lineage. Makeda travels to Jerusalem because she hears rumors of Solomon's wisdom. She does not come lightly. She comes with attendants, with animals, with gifts, with questions that have traveled ahead of her like heat. The road itself becomes part of the story. Caravans move slowly. Water is counted. Shade is precious. Dust rises from hooves and hangs in the air behind the travelers like a second sky. There is time on the journey for a mind to change. There is time for old worship to feel thin and for curiosity to become hunger. Solomon receives her with the confidence of a king who believes his court is the center of the world. She tests him. He answers. But here, the Kebra Nagast adds something decisive. Makeda is not only impressed, she is transformed. She turns away from the worship of the sun and the moon and the stars. She is drawn toward the God of Israel. Why does the story insist on this conversion? Because the epic is building a bridge from Ethiopia to Israel, a bridge not of trade, but of covenant. In the Kebra Nagast, Solomon and Makeda conceive a child, a son named Menelik. Menelik grows in Ethiopia as a prince. Years later, he travels to Jerusalem to meet his father, and this is where the story begins to change shape, because Solomon does not want to let him go. Solomon receives Menelik with celebration. He shows him the city, the court, the treasures, the priests, the rituals that keep Israel's identity intact. He offers Menelik status, honor, a place in the line, and then the offer becomes heavier. Stay, rule, inherit. But Menelik chooses Ethiopia. Why would a son refuse Solomon's throne? It becomes a symbol, a refusal of the obvious center and a choice of a different one. The Kebra Nagast wants you to see it clearly. Menelik is not being exiled. He is choosing a destiny, a different center. Solomon responds with a decision that looks, at first, like generosity. He assigns companions to Menelik, not random attendants, not hired soldiers. The firstborn sons of the nobles of Israel, the oldest sons of the great houses, the heirs. He sends Israel's future with Menelik. This detail matters. It is one of the epic's boldest moves, because the firstborn are not just people, they are continuity. To send the firstborn is to send the next chapter of Israel's story. Solomon does it for the oldest reason kings make choices like this, to bind a future to his own. Because if Menelik is leaving, Solomon wants Israel to be tied to him anyway. He wants a living bridge, and the firstborn sons go, partly in honor, partly in sorrow, partly as politics. Now imagine the emotion. Imagine a father sending away the heirs of his court. Imagine mothers watching their firstborn sons depart. Imagine nobles swallowing grief because the king has spoken. And imagine the firstborn sons themselves, proud, afraid, excited, angry, feeling the weight of being chosen for something that cannot be undone. A convoy forms, horses, supplies, gold, scrolls, food, arms. They prepare routes. They count days. They make plans for the return. Menelik prepares to leave Jerusalem, and then the story shifts into a heist, because in the Kebra Nagast, the Ark of the Covenant does not politely transfer ownership. It is taken. The Ark is the great object of biblical imagination, a chest of acacia wood overlaid with gold, the seat of presence, a symbol of covenant. In Israel's story, the Ark sits in the Holy of Holies. It is guarded, handled with fear, treated as dangerous in its holiness. In Ethiopia's story, the Ark does not vanish into nothingness. It moves. The Kebra Nagast describes how one of the companions, often named Azariah, the son of the high priest, becomes central to the plot. Azariah becomes convinced the Ark belongs with Menelik, not as loot, as destiny. So he and the firstborn sons devise a plan. They create a replica, a copy of the Ark, a decoy. They prepare it carefully, because a sloppy decoy is a confession. They match dimensions. They match weight as closely as they can. They cover it the same way. Then they wait for night. They watch the rhythm of guards. They wait for a shift. They wait for the moment when the world is tired and the mind is less sharp. And then they enter, quietly, with cloth, with controlled breath. The Ark is not out in the open. It is behind curtains, inside layers, inside the logic of holiness. Hands that touch it must be careful, not only for safety, for meaning. So the movement is slow. The curtain moves. The air changes. A lamp flickers. A shadow slides across gold. They place the replica. They lift the ark. Replica in, ark out. Then they move. The most sacred object in Israel is removed without Solomon's permission. Ask yourself, why would the epic choose a heist instead of a blessing? Because a heist makes the object feel alive. If the ark is truly sacred, it should not be something a king can simply give away. It must move with destiny, not paperwork. Then comes the moment of departure. Menelik's convoy leaves Jerusalem, and as they travel, the story insists something strange. The convoy moves faster than it should, as if carried, as if the ark itself lightens the world around it. Some versions describe angels, invisible assistants, a sense that the journey is being accelerated from above. The Kebra Nagast wants you to feel inevitability, not luck, not coincidence, inevitability. Eventually, Solomon discovers the truth. The ark is gone. And this is where the story becomes human again. Solomon is furious. He is grieving. He is humiliated. He sends riders after them, but it is too late. The ark has crossed the boundary, and the boundary matters. Once the ark leaves, Israel's center shifts. The epic wants you to feel that shift as moral, not political. It suggests, the covenant has moved. In the logic of the epic, once the ark leaves, the center shifts. A people must decide where holiness now lives. Ethiopia's answer is bold. It says, the center is here, in Aksum, in a chapel, guarded by one monk appointed for life. No cameras, no journalists, no scholars, no inspection. Not because of paranoia, because of sanctity. The tradition forbids examination, and so the question cannot be resolved from outside the tradition. But for tonight's story, the literal object matters less than the claim, because the claim shapes behavior. A church that believes it guards the ark has no reason to defer to Rome's list of approved books. A church that traces its lineage through Solomon and Sheba has no reason to shrink its library because a distant tradition standardized a shorter table of contents. Ethiopia's canon is larger, not because Ethiopia rebelled against a standard. It is larger because Ethiopia never accepted that another tradition had authority over its shelf. And this identity is not only written, it is performed. The tradition of the tableau reinforces the ark story in daily life. A tableau is a sacred tablet that represents the ark. Every Ethiopian church has one. It is wrapped in cloth, never displayed openly. During major festivals like Timkat, tableaux are carried in procession under bright ceremonial umbrellas, chanting, drums, feet on stone, a rhythm that doesn't rush. The concealment is part of the power. It says, this is not for the gaze, this is for the covenant. What does it do to a community's memory when its sacred symbols are carried through the streets every year? A story repeated with the body becomes hard to erase. And what is hard to erase is easy to preserve. So the Kebra Nagast is not only an epic about kings, it is a preservation engine. It tells Ethiopia who it is, and a community that sees itself as guardian will act like a guardian. It will lock chests, maintain manuscripts, train scribes, repeat stories until they become furniture in the mind. That is how shelves stay large. We tend to think of the Bible as fixed, one book, one list, one table of contents that has always been exactly as it is. But canon history is not a single decision. It is a long argument, and it stayed messy for far longer than most people realize. Start with the simplest reality. In the 1st and 2nd centuries, there was no universal Christian New Testament. They were communities, letters, gospels, collections copied in different places. A church in Rome might have texts a church in Syria had never seen. A church in Alexandria might read a book as essential that a church in Gaul had never heard of. So how did anyone decide what counted as scripture? Authority did not arrive as a stamp. It accumulated through use, argument, and repetition. Part of the answer is practical. Manuscripts are expensive. Copying takes time. A community cannot copy everything forever, so choices happen. Not always with debate, sometimes with habit. A book that is read aloud in worship gets copied. A book that is not read aloud becomes private. A private book becomes rare. A rare book becomes unknown. That is canon formation without a meeting. Another part of the answer is conflict. When rival teachers arise, communities want clarity. When false letters circulate, communities want tests. When a message spreads quickly, communities want boundaries. And those tests become familiar over time. Apostolic origin, consistency with what the community already believes. Widespread usage, usefulness for teaching, a sense that the text speaks with authority. Not every community weighted those tests the same way, but the logic was there. A library becomes a library by repeated use. This is also the era when challenges forced decisions. A teacher like Marcion proposed a reduced collection, rejecting much of the Jewish scriptural inheritance. Whether a community agreed or not, the pressure of that proposal sharpened boundaries. In other words, controversy acted like a filter. It made people ask, more urgently, what they were willing to read aloud and call true. One of the earliest surviving attempts at a list is something called the Muratorian fragment. It is usually dated to the late 2nd century, often around 170 AD. It is not a neat inventory. It is damaged. It is itself fragmentary. The earliest canon list we have survives as a broken page, and in that broken page, you can see the mess. Some books are accepted, some are disputed, some are warned against, some are missing because the beginning of the list is lost. It suggests a world where the edges are still soft, where scripture is being negotiated in real time. If early Christianity itself debated books for centuries, why do modern readers expect the shelf to be simple? Even the word canon helps explain the problem. Canon means a rule, a measuring stick, a standard. But standards only emerge when many people agree to use the same measure. In the first centuries, there were many measures. Some communities read the Shepherd of Hermas with deep respect. Others ignored it. Some used texts like the Didache as guidance. Some treated them as secondary. Some treasured apocalypses. Some feared them. And all of that happened while Christian communities were still small, still scattered, still negotiating identity under pressure. Later writers speak openly about disputed books. Eusebius, in the early 4th century, lists categories: books accepted by everyone, books disputed but known, books rejected. This is not scandal. This is formation. It shows you that the Bible did not arrive as one sealed package. It arrived as a shelf that gradually stopped moving. In the 4th century, Athanasius of Alexandria writes his famous Festal Letter. He names the 27 books of the New Testament that later become standard in most traditions. That letter matters, but it is not an empire-wide switch. It is a regional statement of practice, a list in a world of lists. Councils in North Africa, Hippo in 393, Carthage in 397 and 419, also produce lists that resemble the later Catholic canon. Again, not because a single meeting created the Bible, but because communities were converging. They were stabilizing what they already used. Practice first, lists later. Before we jump, notice something else. Language decides what can travel. For many early Christians, the scriptures they read were in Greek. The Greek translations of Jewish scriptures were widely used, and Greek-speaking regions inherited a wider textual environment. Then, in the West, Latin becomes dominant, and a Latin corridor is narrower by default. Not because Latin is inferior, because fewer texts made the crossing in. Once a text fails to cross a language boundary, it becomes invisible to that world. Not false, invisible. Ethiopia did not inherit its shelf through Latin. It inherited through the Alexandrian corridor, through a world where Greek and Semitic traditions overlapped, where wider collections could remain normal. That one fact explains an entire difference in tables of contents. Now jump forward to the 16th century. The printing press changes everything. Because once books are printed, a table of contents becomes visible. It becomes reproducible. It becomes something you can standardize at scale. And once the shelf is printed, it starts to feel eternal. It feels like destiny, but it is still history. Martin Luther enters this story not only because he moved books, but because he questioned more than many people realize. Luther argued that certain Old Testament books, Tobit, Judith, Wisdom, Sirach, Baruch, 1st and 2nd Maccabees, were useful to read, but not equal in authority. So in many Protestant traditions, these books were placed in a separate section called the Apocrypha, and later, in many editions, removed entirely. A shelf shrank by 7 books in a few decades. But Luther's discomfort didn't stop there. He also hesitated over New Testament books, James, Hebrews, Revelation, and at times, Jude. James troubled him because it seemed to him to emphasize works in a way he feared contradicted his theology of faith. Hebrews had unclear authorship. It didn't name Paul. Its style felt different. Revelation was strange, violent, symbolic, hard to preach, easy to misuse. So ask the question most people never ask. If Luther nearly cut books that every Protestant now takes for granted, what does that say about how settled the canon really was? In practice, Luther kept them, often with notes, often with caution. And the reason they remained is the same reason most canons eventually settle. They were already used widely. They were already embedded. They were already hard to remove without tearing the fabric. Canon is not only a theological argument. Canon is also inertia. Then comes the Catholic response. At the Council of Trent in 1546, the Catholic Church formally declared the disputed Old Testament books canonical. The Catholic canon stabilized at 73 books. Eastern Orthodox traditions remained slightly different again. Some include 3rd Maccabees. Some include Psalm 151. Some include the Prayer of Manasseh. And then Ethiopia stands apart. 81 books, including Enoch, including Jubilees, including the 3 books of Maccabean, including texts that exist in no other Christian tradition on earth. The point here is not to crown a winner. It is to break the illusion. The Bible has never been a single, universally agreed collection. It has always been a family of collections, shaped by language, geography, theology, politics, and the slow economy of copying. So when English-speaking modernity treats 66 as default, it is not because 66 is destiny. It is because English became globally powerful, because printing amplified one shelf, because missionaries carried one table of contents farthest. That is cultural visibility, not eternal proof. What happens to a tradition's sense of identity when it discovers its shelf was always wider than it thought? Some people feel threatened. Some feel curious. Some feel angry. But historically, it is normal. It is what happens when you step outside your corridor and notice there were other corridors all along. Ethiopia is one of those corridors, a place where wider shelves remained ordinary. So standard is not a law. It is a habit that became common enough to feel like law. And if you have never opened a Bible, the story of the Ethiopian canon teaches something important about how knowledge survives. Survival is not always a verdict on quality. A text can be brilliant, influential, widely read in its own time, and still disappear simply because it missed the wrong translation corridor. And a text can endure for millennia because it stayed inside regular use. A chain of hands kept copying. In Ethiopia, the chain held. The Dead Sea Scrolls prove that Enoch and Jubilees mattered in the ancient world. They were copied, studied, used. But popularity in the 2nd century before Christ did not guarantee survival in the 5th century after. Survival required continuity. Consider how much knowledge humanity has lost, not because it was false, but because nobody copied it at the right moment. Now consider the Watchers again. Beings who gave humanity tools before humanity was ready for them. Metallurgy before wisdom. Weapons before restraint. Persuasion before emotional maturity. Power before trust. This is an ancient story, but it is also a modern mirror. We gave ourselves the internet before we built media literacy. We built a global information engine before we taught people how to filter truth from performance. Before we taught children how to separate signal from noise. Before we built the social rituals that slow rumor down. And we can see the result. Conspiracy, manipulation, outrage as currency, attention hijacked at scale. What happens to a society when information moves faster than its ability to interpret? We built social media before emotional regulation. We gave billions of people a stage before we taught people what constant comparison does to identity, before we understood what algorithmic reward systems do to anxiety, envy, and attention, before we developed the cultural equivalent of seatbelts. We created a machine that amplifies whatever is most contagious: anger, fear, shame, desire. If the Watchers taught cosmetics alongside weapons, what are the modern equivalents of that pairing? We split atoms before international trust was mature enough to hold that power safely. We discovered nuclear energy, and almost immediately discovered nuclear threat. A tool that can light cities. A tool that can erase cities. Then we built treaties and inspection regimes to keep catastrophe at bay. Even now the fear remains. Power arrived first. Wisdom chased after it. We mapped the genome before we agreed on the ethics of editing it. We built the ability to rewrite biology before we settled on where we should stop. Before we built global trust, strong enough to handle uneven access. Before we agreed on what improvement even means. When a tool can alter the future of a species, who gets to decide what counts as harm? We built fossil fuel civilization before we built global climate governance. We learned how to burn ancient carbon and remake the surface of the planet. Only later did we learn what that bargain costs. Only later did we try to build systems of cooperation strong enough to respond. Again, a speed mismatch. We built antibiotics before we understood resistance. We were given a tool that looked like pure rescue, and then the tool reshaped evolution. It asked for discipline, for stewardship, for restraint. The tool arrived quickly. The wisdom arrived slowly. We built drones, sensors, and surveillance before we agreed on the ethics of being watched. We built finance at planetary speed before we built planetary literacy. Derivatives, leverage, and instant markets made wealth move like weather. Then crashes taught lessons the hard way. A tool for coordination became, in the wrong hands, a tool for contagion. Power arrived. Wisdom arrived late. We built recommendation algorithms before we built a culture that can resist them. We handed the job of what you should see next to machines optimizing for attention. And attention is not the same thing as truth. So a new kind of lectionary emerged. Not a church lectionary, an algorithmic one. A schedule of what you will be exposed to, what you will repeat, what you will think is normal. And most people did not choose that schedule. They inherited it. We built deepfakes and voice cloning before we built everyday verification. We created a world where a face can lie convincingly on video, where a voice can be simulated, where persuasion can be automated at scale. And only after the tool exists do we scramble to build signals of authenticity, watermarks, provenance, protocols. Again, the same old pattern. We placed cameras and microphones in cities. We built systems that can track movement and behavior at scale. We did it for safety, for convenience, for efficiency. And only later did we ask what privacy means when the default is observation. And now we are doing something similar again. We are building systems that can generate language, images, and persuasion at scale. Tools that can imitate the surface of thought. We are doing it before we have agreed on norms for trust, before we have taught ourselves how to live inside synthetic reality. Are we living through another Watcher's moment? Not angels, not myths. A speed mismatch. Tools arriving before the culture is ready. And it matters because the same forces are still operating. Not angels, not deserts, just economics. What gets copied becomes common. What becomes common becomes normal. And what becomes normal starts to feel like truth. So when a shelf shrinks, it doesn't always shrink because someone proved a book was wrong. It shrinks because fewer people had access, because a curriculum changed, because a translation never happened, because the reading schedule moved on. That is a quieter kind of loss, and it is the kind that happens all the time. This is why the Ethiopian Bible matters even for people who don't care about religion, because it shows you how fragile knowledge is, how dependent it is on custody, on routine, on communities that keep copying. An idea as enduring as Enoch's warning nearly vanished from the mainstream for 1,000 years. The Western rediscovery depended on one man, one journey, and 3 manuscripts carried back in 1773. That is not myth. That is logistics. And logistics decides what the future can remember. The digital age makes this feel safer, but it isn't. We have copies everywhere, so we assume nothing can be lost. But formats change, servers fail, links rot, hard drives die quietly in drawers, entire platforms disappear. Knowledge can vanish without fire. It can vanish through neglect. And the opposite is also true. A small group with discipline can preserve more than an empire with abundance. A community that keeps the same practices for centuries can outlast a global culture that changes its storage every decade. That is what Ethiopia demonstrates. Not perfection, continuity. A larger past can feel unsettling at first because it means you inherited only one corridor. But it can also feel comforting because it means the story was always bigger than your shelf. There were always more rooms, more voices, more ways communities try to describe the same human problems. Power, fear, order, time, and the distance between knowledge and wisdom. Enoch is one way of talking about power. Jubilees is one way of talking about time. The Dead Sea Scrolls remind you that survival depends on copying, and Ethiopia proves that memory can be guarded. And if you want a practical takeaway, it is almost embarrassingly simple. Treat preservation as an action, not a feeling. Save what matters. Back it up. Print it. Teach it. Repeat it. In religion, that looks like lectionaries and chants. In culture, it looks like libraries and archives. In personal life, it looks like habits that keep your own knowledge from evaporating. Because memory is not only inside the mind, memory is also inside routines. So maybe the final lesson is quiet. Do not confuse what is familiar with what is complete. And do not assume the books you inherited are the only books that ever mattered. There were always other shelves. Somewhere, someone kept copying. Tonight, we followed a library. We began in stone corridors and candlelight, in churches carved into the earth in the Ethiopian highlands. We learned that 81 is not an unusual number of books. It is the number that results from never stopping the work of copying. We opened 2 famous doors. The Book of Enoch, with its watchers who crossed the boundary between heaven and earth and gave humanity knowledge it was not ready to carry. Azazel, with his swords and his cosmetics. Semjaza with his enchantments. 200 angels descending to Mount Hermon to swear an oath that would change the world. And the Book of Jubilees, with its precise architecture of sacred time, its 364-day calendar, its insistence that the rhythm of the cosmos was set at creation and was not meant to drift. We followed the manuscripts to the caves near the Dead Sea. where fragments proved that these texts were not fringe, but central. 15 copies of Jubilees at Qumran, 11 manuscripts of Enoch, more popular in an ancient library than some books we now consider standard. We stood in Aksum, where the Ethiopian church claims to guard the Ark of the Covenant behind a curtain that no outsider has parted. And we sat with the quiet, almost inevitable law that governs all of manuscript history. A book survives when people keep copying it. A book fades when they stop. Ethiopia kept copying, so the shelves stayed larger. And now, because the chain of hands never broke, the rest of the world can read what it nearly lost forever. Somewhere in the Ethiopian highlands tonight, there is a monastery where a priest is reading from a manuscript written in Ge'ez. The words he reads include passages from the Book of Enoch, passages about watchers and boundaries and the cost of knowledge given too soon. Those words are being read tonight because someone, centuries ago, decided they were worth the labor of reproducing, and someone after them decided the same, and someone after them. A chain of hands reaching back through time, each one keeping the words alive for the next. That chain never broke in Ethiopia. It broke almost everywhere else. You do not need to hold on to any of this. Not the numbers, not the names, not the dates, not the debates about which tradition got it right. Just the quiet sense that the story is larger than the version you inherited. That somewhere, in a church carved from stone, on a mountaintop most people will never visit, there are pages that hold answers to questions we are only now learning how to ask. And they have been there all along. Now let the details loosen. Let names become soft. Let dates dissolve. Let the arguments about canons and translations and councils fade into the background, the way a conversation in another room fades when you stop trying to hear it. Imagine the scribe again. The lamp is small. The flame shifts when the wind moves outside the window. The pen scratches lightly against the vellum. The ink darkens the page like a quiet shadow settling into place. A line is finished. A breath is released. The hand pauses. Outside, a dog barks once and then falls silent. A distant insect sings in the grass. Stone holds the coolness of night. The book is closed, not slammed, placed, covered. The chest lid lowers gently, and with that motion, the library returns to darkness. Not lost, held, safe. Hold one final image. A table, a lamp, a page. Not a modern desk, just a simple surface, a candle stub, a small pool of wax, a faint smell of smoke. A hand moves, stops, moves again. A letter is drawn with care, then another, then another. The book grows, line by line, the way a river grows, not all at once, but with the steady accumulation of what flows into it. Outside, the night continues its own quiet work. Wind over stone, cold air descending from the mountains, stars appearing one by one in a sky that has looked the same for thousands of years. Inside, the library continues too. Not to impress anyone, not to win an argument, just to keep the shelf standing for one more generation. And that is enough. Let the library close its doors, not with a lock, just with candlelight, just with calm. The manuscripts are safe. They have been patient for 17 centuries. They do not need you to stay awake for them. They can wait until morning. Now the mind can loosen its grip. You do not need to solve anything. You do not need to decide what belongs where. You only need the image of continuity. A lamp that keeps being lit. A page that keeps being written. A community that kept copying. That is the whole secret. And because of that, a shelf survived. Now you can let the shelf stand on its own, and you can rest. Sleep now, like ink settling into parchment, like words absorbed into the page, like a library at the end of the day, every book in its place. The words will be there in the morning. They always have been. And if you let this story settle, it becomes less about lists and more about custody. A tradition is not only what it believes, it is what it keeps doing. A chant repeated, a feast kept on time, a manuscript copied even when nobody outside the monastery is asking for it. That is how the long memory survives. So as the narration drifts towards silence, hold the simplest image. A lamp, a page, a hand that keeps moving. Not fast, not anxious, just steady. And maybe that is the final surprise of this whole subject. The largest canon does not feel loud in Ethiopia. It feels normal. A wider shelf does not have to be a threat. It can be a quiet inheritance. More rooms in the library, more lamps, more pages, and none of it requires you to solve every question tonight. You can let the questions rest. You can let the images remain. Desert caves, clay jars, highland monasteries, bright umbrellas in procession, a tablet wrapped in cloth, a calendar that refuses to drift. If your mind wants to keep searching for conclusions, you can soften that impulse. Because in the end, this is a story about continuity, about what survives when people keep doing the same careful thing. A hand copying, a voice reading, a community repeating. That is enough. Now let the rooms dim, let the shelves fade, let the ink settle, slowly. Outside, the world continues, but in here, the story is finished. The only thing left is the soft after-image, a page turning, a candle breathing, a distant chant thinning into wind. If you notice your thoughts trying to organize everything into a list, you can smile at that. It is only the mind doing what minds do. You do not have to hold it. You can let it drift. And as you drift, remember the simplest point. Nothing here was preserved by force. It was preserved by gentle repetition. That kind of repetition is calming. It is steady. It is human. Some stories end with answers. This one ends with shelves and hands and time. If anything still feels unresolved, it can remain unresolved. The mind can set it down. The night can hold it without effort for now, until morning, quietly.